This week, Congressional drug warriors have a love fest on Capitol Hill with acting drug czar Michael Botticelli. Research indicates that medical marijuana legalization may have a positive impact on lowering crime rates. The UN Human Rights Committee criticizes the U.S.'s human rights performance. And we get all literary and take a look at a couple of good new books on drug policy. Hello, and welcome to the Drug Policy Facts Podcast for April 1st, 2014. I'm your host, Doug McVeigh, editor of Drug War Facts and drugwarfacts.org. This week's edition is number 21 in the series. The Drug Policy Facts Podcast is brought to you by Common Sense for Drug Policy and is hosted through podcastgarden.com. The URL to listen or subscribe is podcastgarden.com/podcast/drugwarfacts. You can find Drug War Facts on the web at drugwarfacts.org. Follow us on Twitter, where we're at Drug Policy Facts. Also, check us out on Facebook, and give the Drug War Facts page a like. Share it with friends. We're now being heard at 420radio.org on Wednesdays at 8 a.m., Thursdays at 11 p.m., and Saturdays at 9 a.m. If you're listening via 420 Radio, thanks. If you enjoy the content, subscribe, and check out our website at drugwarfacts.org. The Drug Policy Facts Podcast is brought to you by Common Sense for Drug Policy. We do these podcasts as a free public service. We also allow these podcasts to be retransmitted without fees. If you're interested in licensing or syndicating our content, you can get in touch with me through the website at drugwarfacts.org. Now for some news. According to an article titled The Effect of Medical Marijuana Laws on Crime, Evidence from State Panel Data 1990 to 2006, published in March in the journal PLOS 1, medical cannabis laws may have helped bring about a decline in serious crimes in states which have legalized it. At the very least, the researchers found that there does not seem to be any indication that crime increased with the legalization of medical marijuana. The researchers in this are being careful, and they should. Data are never as clear-cut as we might like, and causation can be very hard to determine. Let's read part of the discussion and conclusion. Quote, "In sum, these findings run counter to arguments suggesting that legalization of marijuana for medical purposes poses a danger to public health in terms of exposure to violent crime and property crimes. To be sure, medical marijuana laws were not found to have a crime-exacerbating effect on any of the 7 crime types. On the contrary, our findings indicated that medical marijuana legalization precedes a reduction in homicide and assault. While it is important to remain cautious when interpreting these findings as evidence that medical marijuana legalization reduces crimes, these findings do fall in line with recent evidence, and they conform to the long-standing notion that marijuana legalization may lead to a reduction in alcohol use due to individuals substituting marijuana for alcohol. Given the relationship between alcohol and violent crime, it may turn out that substituting marijuana for alcohol leads to minor reductions in violent crimes that can be detected at the state level. That said, it also remains possible that these associations are statistical artifacts." End quote. Again, it's important here to be cautious because that speaks to credibility. It is entirely possible that in fact there are other variables at play which the researchers failed to examine. I actually don't believe so. I've read their article. The methodology is solid, it's robust, their reasoning is sound, and they seem to cover all the important variables. I've seen plenty of other research which has been trumpeted loudly by some as conclusive proof and which I've picked apart with obvious variables that were left out, and that's just not the case here. And these authors also waited until their work was accepted by a peer-reviewed journal before sending out the news releases. Here's a pro tip. If the news release goes out before an article has been accepted for publication, that's a big red flag. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this one. It looks like medical marijuana legalization may in fact have the effect of helping reduce crime rates, and it seems logical to presume that full-on adult social use marijuana legalization could have the same effect. It helps, of course, that I've been saying that for, my gosh, more than 30 years now, ever since Jack Herer taught me about marijuana and hemp, and he trained me as a reefer raider. And it's why I'm only cautiously optimistic. I know we're right. We just have to prove it 7 ways to Sunday before we'll ever get taken seriously. Now then, let's turn to the bookshelf. A couple of new volumes have arrived, and I'm really excited to tell you about them. The first is Meth Mania, A History of Methamphetamine by Nicholas L. Parsons. Parsons is an assistant professor of sociology at Eastern Connecticut State University. He's put together an excellent look at the panics over methamphetamine. There's a concept I want to mention before we go any further, and it's called generational forgetting. Here's a definition of that from the Monitoring the Future Survey overview for 2013. Quote, "Another point worth keeping in mind is that there tends to be a continuous flow of new drugs onto the scene and of older ones being rediscovered by young people. Many drugs have made a comeback years after they first fell from popularity, often because knowledge among youth of their adverse consequences faded as generational replacement took place. We call this process generational forgetting. Examples include LSD and methamphetamine, two drugs used widely in the 1960s that made a comeback in the 1990s after their initial popularity faded as a result of their adverse consequences becoming widely recognized during periods of high use. End quote. Right, so with generational forgetting in mind, let's get back to the book. This is an academic work. It's part of the Social Problems, Social Construction series by Lynn Reiner Publishers. Fortunately, it's well written because it's very informative. Parsons has done a great job of examining the history of methamphetamines, from development through current days. He pays particular attention to the hysteria which has erupted around methamphetamine use at a few points over the past 50 years, from speed kills in the 1960s through crystal meth and Breaking Bad of recent times. Parsons does a great job of debunking the myths which surround meth and presenting the facts. In a final chapter, Parsons looks at whether this tendency of the American public toward drug hysteria might be playing out once again around new psychoactive substances such as bath salts. He concludes the book by writing, quote, "Persons who have become dependent on drugs are often encouraged to find the strength to break the cycle of addiction, a cycle that consists partly of the comfort afforded by the routines associated with drug use. In a similar vein, but on a societal level, policymakers, claims makers, and audiences in the United States have grown comfortable with the standard of sensationalizing drug problems and with the tradition of the knee-jerk, lock-em-up reactions that routinely follow. If we genuinely seek to limit the amount of societal harm inflicted by drugs, much like the individual drug addict, we must strive to break the cycle of familiarity to which we have been accustomed to think and talk about drugs." End quote. Absolutely. Meth Mania, A History of Methamphetamine by Nicholas L. Parsons belongs on any drug policy reformer's bookshelf. Now, the other book we're looking at today is To End the War on Drugs, A Guide for Politicians, the Press, and the Public by Dean Becker. Dean is the founder and executive producer of the Drug Truth Network. For the past 15 years, Dean has produced 2 half-hour programs each week, The Century of Lies Show and Cultural Baggage, as well as a daily 3-minute news brief called the 420 News. His Drug Truth Network is real radio, as in terrestrial. DTN programming is produced at the Pacifica Network's KPFT-FM in Houston, Texas, and syndicated to DTN affiliate stations around the U.S. and Canada, as well as being made available through the Pacifica Network's own audio services. For information about syndication, get in touch with Dean through the website at drugtruth.net. There you'll find all his programs and podcasts available for download. Now, I've worked with Dean for quite a while, contributing news segments and from time to time even putting together whole shows. According to Dean, I'm currently the longest-serving reporter for the Drug Truth Network. Well, other than himself, obviously. That's why this has to be a relatively short review. I mean, obviously I'm biased. I'm in it. This book is a collection of the best of DTN programming. With 15 years of great guests, interesting interviews, and really informative reporting, he had a lot to choose from, so narrowing it down to just the items he did must have been extremely tough, and he did a really great job. If you want to know about the drug war from the mouths of the people who've been fighting for reform over the past 15-plus years, well, this is the book for you. Again, that's Dean Becker's To End the War on Drugs, a guide for politicians, the press, and the public. Now back to the news. The UN's Human Rights Committee recently issued a report on the U.S. human rights record and our adherence to the UN's human rights treaties. Our country is deficient in several areas. Unsurprisingly, problems like torture of foreign citizens, drone strikes, Guantanamo Bay, and domestic surveillance were included among the concerns. Other areas more directly related to the war on drugs that were criticized by the committee's report included racial disparities and bias in the criminal justice system, racial profiling, felony disenfranchisement, and much more. Here are some quotes from the report. Regarding racial disparities in the criminal justice system, quote, "While appreciating the steps taken by the state party to address racial disparities in the criminal justice system, including the enactment in August 2010 of the Fair Sentencing Act and plans to work on reform of mandatory minimum sentencing statutes, the committee continues to be concerned about racial disparities at different stages in the criminal justice system, sentencing disparities, and the overrepresentation of individuals belonging to racial and ethnic minorities in prisons and jails." End quote. Regarding racial profiling, quote, "While welcoming plans to reform the stop and frisk program in New York City, The committee remains concerned about the practice of racial profiling and surveillance by law enforcement officials targeting certain ethnic minorities and the surveillance of Muslims undertaken by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the New York Police Department in the absence of any suspicion of wrongdoing." End quote. Regarding death penalty, quote, "While welcoming the overall decline in the number of executions and the increasing number of states that have abolished the death penalty, the committee remains concerned about the continuing use of the death penalty and, in particular, racial disparities in its imposition that affects disproportionately African Americans, exacerbated by the rule that discrimination has to be proven case by case. It is further concerned by the high number of persons wrongly sentenced to death despite existing safeguards, and by the fact that 16 retentionist states do not provide for compensation for the wrongfully convicted, and other states provide for insufficient compensation. Finally, the committee notes with concern reports about the administration by some states of untested lethal drugs to execute prisoners and the withholding of information on such drugs." End quote. Regarding gun violence, quote, "While acknowledging the measures taken to reduce gun violence, the committee remains concerned about the continuing high numbers of gun-related deaths and injuries and the disparate impact of gun violence on minorities, women, and children. While commending the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights' investigation of the discriminatory effect of Stand Your Ground laws, the committee is concerned about the proliferation of such laws that are used to circumvent the limits of legitimate self-defense in violation of the state party's duty to protect life." End quote. Regarding excessive use of force by law enforcement officials, quote, "The committee is concerned about the still high number of fatal shootings by certain police forces, including, for instance, in Chicago, and reports of excessive use of force by certain law enforcement officers, including the deadly use of tasers, which have a disparate impact on African Americans, and use of lethal force by Customs and Border Protection officers at the U.S.-Mexico border." End quote. Regarding non-consensual psychiatric treatment, quote, "The committee is concerned about the widespread use of non-consensual psychiatric medication, electroshock, and other restrictive and coercive practices in mental health services." End quote. Regarding conditions of detention and solitary confinement, quote, "The committee is concerned about the continued practice of holding persons deprived of their liberty, including juveniles and persons with mental disabilities under certain circumstances, in prolonged solitary confinement, and about detainees being held in solitary confinement also in pretrial detention. The committee is furthermore concerned about poor detention conditions in death row facilities." End quote. Regarding voting rights, quote, "While noting with satisfaction Attorney General Holder's statement of 11 February 2014 calling for a reform of prisoner disenfranchisement state laws, the committee reiterate its concern about the persistence of state-level felon disenfranchisement laws, its disproportionate impact on minorities, and the lengthy and cumbersome state voting restoration procedures. The committee is further concerned that voter identification and other recently introduced eligibility requirements may impose excessive burdens on voters, resulting in de facto disenfranchisement of large numbers of voters, including members of minority groups. Finally, the committee reiterates its concern that residents of the District of Columbia are denied the right to vote for and election of voting representatives to the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives." End quote. The full report can be found through the website for the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights at ohchr.org. You're listening to the Drug Policy Facts Podcast. I'm your host, Doug McVeigh, editor of drugwarfacts.org. Now, finally, on March 24th, there was yet another hearing on Capitol Hill about federal drug policy. As loyal listeners will recall, there have been quite a few exciting hearings recently, as we've heard members of Congress lambast officials from the Justice Department and the Office of National Drug Control Policy as they urge a rethink of current laws. Well, now for something completely different. Acting Director of ONDCP, Michael Botticelli, recently testified before the Financial Services and General Government Subcommittee of the House Appropriations Committee. This was a hearing on the White House's proposed fiscal year 2015 drug control budget. This hearing was in many ways an excellent reality check. It's nice to have oversight hearings where members who support reform are allowed to participate and ask tough questions, possibly in trade for their votes on something heinous, and I'd really rather not think about that. The members of Congress running this show are not what would be called friends of reform. Our allies are still in the minority, at least for now. So this budget hearing was important. It's not merely that it's an election year. There are programs which bring a lot of money into congressional districts. Some less charitable sorts refer to that as pork. Still, the drug war means money not only for law enforcement. There are also locally based organizations and service agencies which receive money for what they term anti-drug work. All of these are groups which provide valuable local political support and campaign endorsements, and which no politician can afford to alienate. Something we reformers should bear in mind. So now, let's get to the hearing. The subcommittee chair is Representative Andrew Crenshaw, a Republican representing the 4th District of Florida, and he opens the hearing. Crenshaw is followed by the ranking minority member, Jose Serrano, a Democrat representing the 15th District in New York. Then we hear from Botticelli.
The subcommittee will come to order. I want to welcome our witness, Acting Director Botticelli. This is the first time he's appeared before the Appropriations Committee, and I appreciate you coming here to testify, and thank you for your service. The Office of National Drug Control Policy is charged with the extremely difficult task of coordinating multiple federal agencies' efforts to address many different drug-related issues at home and abroad. In addition, you administer some of the very effective drug prevention and enforcement grant programs. And today, the committee will examine the Office of National Drug Control Policy's fiscal year 2015 budget request, along with your efforts to develop and coordinate our nation's drug policies. The budget request submitted by the President has some interesting priorities within this subcommittee's jurisdiction. And while the administration is requesting an increase of over $1 billion for the IRS and an increase of over $500 million for the GSA, the administration has recommended a decrease below enacted fiscal year 14 for the high intensity and drug trafficking areas program and the drug-free communities program. Now, both of these are drug prevention and enforcement programs. They're to mobilize communities and increase collaboration among community law enforcement. And I can say that specifically they have a really good impact in my district down in Jacksonville, Florida. And so I would typically applaud proposed reductions in federal spending, but it makes me wonder why these drug prevention and enforcement programs are being reduced, because recently the Attorney General announced that heroin overdoses are, he said, quote, urgent and growing public health crisis, end quote. States are telling our children that marijuana use is okay by decriminalizing recreational marijuana. Our nation's problems with cocaine, meth, and prescription drugs certainly haven't gone down any. And so I find it a little hard to believe that the administration feels that efforts to keep drugs away from our children and out of our communities should be reduced while proposing increases for the bureaucracy of the IRS and deciding to build new federal buildings. But as the agency is charged with developing our nation's drug policies, you have the difficult assignment of ensuring that not only the Department of State, the Department of Defense, the Department of Justice, the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Health and Human Services, and numerous other agencies are all working in coordinated manner to address our highest priority drug concerns. And I look forward to your testimony today on how the Office of National Drug Control Policy is leading these efforts on this coordinated role. More specifically, we have heard concerns that the Food and Drug Administration doesn't always take law enforcement's concerns with prescription drug abuse into account when approving new prescription pain medication. We've also heard concerns that reductions in military spending could significantly reduce counter-narcotics activities in Latin America, and that increases the availability of illegal drugs in the United States. And I hope to hear in your testimony today what you all are doing about some of these major concerns. Our nation continues to fight a drug problem that takes lives, brings about violence, and harms our communities and families, and I know that you and your staff are working hard to keep our country safe and healthy. So once again, Acting Director Botticelli, welcome. I look forward to your testimony, and with that I'd like to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Ranking Member Serrano.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to join you in welcoming the Acting Director of National Drug Control Policy, Michael Botticelli. I love that name. He used to be the second baseman for the Boston Red Sox. The Office of National Drug Control Policy's mission places it at the forefront of federal drug policy and the intersection of several federal agencies, such as the Department of Justice, Transportation, State, and the Treasury. The fiscal year 2015 budget request for ONDCP is approximately $311 million, a decrease of $55 million from the fiscal year 14 funding level. This will hopefully be targeted towards improved coordination and oversight of interagency drug control programs and policies, something I continue to be concerned about with regards to the agency. This issue is particularly relevant in light of the Attorney General Eric Holder's recent proposal for reduced drug sentencing. I hope we will be able to discuss this issue so I can better understand your role in these efforts and learn what you're doing to reform some of our criminal justice policies with regard to drugs. I also continue to be interested in the development of a Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy. The fiscal year 2014 Consolidated Appropriations Act included language requiring your agency to develop a comprehensive Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy, just as you have done for other U.S. borders. I believe this is not only an issue of parity, but extremely critical because of increased drug trafficking in the region. It is essential that Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands are integrated into federal counter-narcotics strategy. I look forward to discussing these and other issues with you in detail. Thank you for your service and for appearing before us today.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers wanted to be here today, but he could not be here and sends his regards. And so without objection, I'll make his statement part of the record. And so now, Acting Director Botticelli, I think about art when I think about Botticelli.
Art?
Art.
Okay. Okay, so he's an opera singer for the Boston Red Sox.
Okay. But anyway, if you could keep your remarks to about 5 minutes or so, that'll give us time for questions, and then your entire statement will be submitted for the record. So, Mr. Botticelli.
Thank you. Chairman Crenshaw, Ranking Member Serrano, members of the subcommittee. As indicated, my name is Michael Botticelli. I'm the Acting Director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. I am pleased to appear before you today to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2015 budget request for ONDCP, part of the Executive Office of the President. ONDCP was created by statute in 1988, and November 2013 marked our office's 25th anniversary. ONDCP establishes policies, priorities, and objectives for the nation's drug control program. The goals of the program are to coordinate the federal government's efforts to reduce illicit drug use and its consequences, including drug manufacturing and trafficking, drug-related crime and violence, and drug-related health consequences. To achieve these goals, the Director of ONDCP is charged with producing the administration's National Drug Control Strategy and ensuring executive branch agency drug control budget spending supports the strategy. The administration's strategy, first released in 2010, is based upon input from public health and public safety professionals across the country and on decades of research from the nation's top scientists that demonstrate that addiction is a brain disease, one that can be prevented, treated, and from which one can recover. ONDCP also has responsibility for working with our national and international partners to develop the National Southwest Border Counter-Narcotics Strategy, the National Northern Border Counter-Narcotics Strategy. In FY 2014, enacted budget also contained a directive for ONDCP to develop a Caribbean Border Counter-Narcotics Strategy, which is now in process. Our nation faces a number of substance use challenges. For instance, there is an epidemic of opioid drug abuse in this country. Drug overdose deaths driven by prescription painkillers surpass homicides and traffic crashes in the number of injury deaths in America. Heroin use remains relatively low in the United States as compared to other drugs, but there has been a troubling increase in the number of people using heroin. Evidence suggests that some users, specifically those with chronic opioid addictions, will substitute heroin for prescription opioids, since heroin is often cheaper than prescription drugs. A recent report from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration found that while only 3.6% of people who had started using prescription drugs non-medically ever initiated heroin use in the following 5-year period. 4/5 of recent heroin initiatives had previously used prescription pain relievers non-medically. These findings demonstrate that we need to take a comprehensive approach to addressing opioid drugs, including more widespread use by first responders of naloxone and emergency opiate overdose reversal medication, as well as expanded access to medication-assisted treatment. Further, multiple studies show that young people's attitudes towards marijuana use and non-medical use of prescription drugs are softening. Each day, an estimated 4,400 young people under the age of 18 initiate drug use for the first time. This can have a profound effect in the future, since research shows us that the earlier a person begins to use drugs, the more likely they are to develop a substance use disorder. To enable ONDCP to accomplish the administration's goals to address these and other numerous challenges from substance use disorders, the President is requesting $311 million for FY 2015. This request represents a decrease of $55 million from ONDCP's FY 2014 enacted budget. However, it has been developed to ensure that we have the resources to meet the strategy's goals while reducing spending. ONDCP's budget requests include funding for 2 grant programs that support efforts throughout the nation to reduce drug use and its consequences. The Drug-Free Communities, or DFC, support program provides grants to local drug-free community coalitions to prevent and reduce youth substance use. Directed by ONDCP in partnership with SAMHSA, the DFC program provides grants to local drug-free community coalitions, enabling them to increase collaboration among community partners and to prevent and reduce youth substance use. During FY 2013, a total of 643 DFC grants were awarded. The President's request for DFC grants program is $85.6 million, a decrease of $6.3 million from the FY 2014 enacted budget. The High-Intensity Drug Trafficking Areas, or HIDTA program, helps improve the efficiency and effectiveness of drug control efforts by facilitating cooperation among federal, state, local, and tribal law enforcement, as well as other drug control organizations. The President's request of $193.4 million for the HIDTA program is a decrease of $45 million from the FY 2014 enacted budget. However, this request maintains the HIDTA's program focus and mission of reducing drug trafficking and production. Core functions will be maintained. In addition to ONDCP's responsibilities to develop and implement the strategy and administer its grants programs, the office is responsible for coordinating, overseeing, and evaluating the effectiveness of agencies comprising the National Drug Control Program throughout the federal government, as well as overseeing the consolidated National Drug Control budget to ensure the drug control funding proposed by these agencies is adequate to carry out the strategy. The President's FY 2015 National Drug Control budget request is $25.4 billion government-wide. This represents an increase of $151 million over the FY 2014 enacted level. Reflecting the need to address both public health and public safety, the portion of the budget requested for drug treatment and prevention efforts, 43%, has grown to its highest level in over 12 years. I'd like to thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Well, thank you very much. Let me start by asking, you mentioned HIDTA was going to be reduced by $45 million, and I mentioned in my opening remarks that it seems like a kind of a strange sense of priorities when you ask for $1 billion for the IRS and $500 million to the General Services Administration, and yet the last couple of years the funding for HIDTA has been reduced in the proposed budgets, but Congress each year has restored that funding. And again, in today's world, when states are legalizing marijuana, poppy production's up in Afghanistan, cocaine, heroin use, all that stuff. What do you think the impact would be if you were to reduce it by $45 million?
Clearly, Chairman, the HIDA program is really essential both at the federal, state, and local level in terms of being able to enhance efficiency and information sharing among law enforcement entities. We consider that an incredibly valuable program. Our challenge was within restrained resources, making sure that we maintain core functions and core services with our HIDA program. So to that extent, this will not result in any elimination of any of our HIDA programs. It will maintain its core mission and core functions. The biggest, I think, impact will be on the HIDA's ability to address emerging drug threats that we see in the community. So it will preserve the core functions and preserve our core HIDA infrastructure.
So in your opinion, that's still effective, the things that you're doing. It's just a matter of not as much money to go around, but as you know, the last couple of years, Congress has restored that funding, and so you wouldn't be upset if that happened again.
We see our HIDA programs as incredibly valuable programs, and one of the things that, as over the past year, that I've seen with our HIDA programs is their ability to be flexible and nimble at the state and local level in terms of really responding, I think, to local threats and local emergencies.
Gotcha. Another question, just briefly, that you have this drug-free community program, and I think there are like 600 coalitions across the United States. They work on mobilizing communities and increase collaboration, things like that. How do you measure the progress that's being made by those community groups? Those are grants, they receive your funds. I mean, how do you go about deciding who's effective, how effective, things like that?
Sure. So one of the things that I think we know is that local drug use patterns are different among localities, and what it requires to really reduce substance use at a local level is really looking at those community factors, but also convening all of the local stakeholders, law enforcement, health and human service agencies, schools, to really look at implementing evidence-based prevention program at the local level. As you indicated, for FY14, we're estimating that we're going to have 672 of those local coalitions. They have been nationally evaluated, and it's been shown that those communities that have drug-free communities programs are able to substantially reduce drug use in their communities. So these are programs that are implementing evidence-based prevention programs and are also nationally evaluated and have been shown to reduce substance use among youth at the local level.
Well, those funds are being reduced or proposed to be reduced. How would that impact your ability? Would you give less grants, or would the grants be smaller? How do you handle that reduction?
Sure. So at this point, it doesn't mean that we would take back any existing grants. So those grants would continue through the grant cycle. What it would mean is that we'd probably be able to award 50 less grants in FY15 compared to what we're estimating for FY 2014.
How much do you think it would take to continue to fund the number of grants that you've funded in the past?
So in terms of looking at kind of level funding in terms of FY14 enacted, that's approximately $92 million for the program, and with other, it's $92 million.
Gotcha. Well, thank you. Mr. Serrano?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That was going to be my first question also that you asked, so let me just... I don't know if you got the number the same way as I see it. It was not you, but Mr. Botticelli. You said 672. That's what it is now. It will be reduced to 614. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And you spoke about spreading the money around more, because see, that's a program that seems to be working. So we're wondering why the administration would want to cut or propose a cut. Mm-hmm. And I think you're hearing something, unless I heard it wrong, some things that you usually don't hear from all members of a committee, and that is asking the question, how can you continue to function at a level that does credit to a program that obviously works and that has the support of many members of this committee?
Clearly our Drug-Free Communities program is one of the backbones of our prevention infrastructure in the United States. It's an incredibly valuable program to us. Obviously, we had to look at how do we have restrained spending in FY 2015. Again, I think the proposal, if enacted, would be that we wouldn't eliminate any of the existing grantees. It just would mean that we'd have about 50 less new grants in FY 2015.
So you don't think it will be a result of reducing from 672 to 614? Because we went by those numbers. There would be a reduction to 614 or not?
So it would be an overall reduction, but it does not mean that we would eliminate any existing grantees. So that money would continue. It just means that we would have less money we would be able to award 50 less grants, new grants in FY 2015.
Okay. Let me ask you about the Caribbean border counter-narcotics strategy. Now that was, as you mentioned, language that was put in the bill at the request of many of us, including the resident commissioner from Puerto Rico, Mr. Pierluisi. Mm-hmm. And, this issue speaks to two situations, and a lot of the Florida members can speak to it. And that is that, first, the territories get less attention than the states. But most importantly, in this case, that we're, shooting ourselves in the foot by allowing one border, if you will, to be totally open, not only to enter the territory, but then to make it to the mainland, as we say. So it's both setting this one up, and I want to hear your thoughts on how quickly that could be set up. Setting this one up not only helps those two territories from having the drugs come into their area, but then it helps the states, especially Florida, with the drugs coming into the states.
Great. Clearly our ability to interdict drugs, particularly in the Caribbean, is really core to the strategy. And as you indicated, the more drugs that we can intercept and interdict, the less that we have coming to our local communities. And clearly, having a Caribbean strategy, I think that supports the work that we're trying to do domestically is particularly important. So we have made progress in terms of the development of that Caribbean strategy. So we've already convened meetings across our interagency looking at how each of our relevant federal interagency partners can support the priority action items of the Caribbean strategy. So, and we continue to work with them, and so that strategy is in progress, and we hope to have that to you shortly.
Well, I hope so, and I know we have other members, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a statement for the record, and that is something I've said over and over and over again in my 24 years in Congress, that anytime drugs enters one of our territories, it has in fact entered the United States. And a lot of people see it as it didn't enter the United States until it gets to Florida or to Texas or to New Mexico. Not true. If it enters any territory under the American flag, it entered the United States, and it should be fought in the same way it's fought when it enters one of the states. And I thank you for your reply.
Great. Thank you. And I was just handed a note. We actually have staff who will be meeting with your staff on Friday to be updating you on our progress to the strategy.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now, there's quite a bit more of that hearing. You can catch the entire thing through the subcommittee website at appropriations.house.gov. So that's it for this week. Thank you for joining us. You have been listening to the Drug Policy Facts Podcast. I'm Doug McVeigh, editor of DrugWarFacts.org. The Drug Policy Facts Podcast is a production of Common Sense for Drug Policy and Drug War Facts. You can find us on the web at DrugWarFacts.org. This podcast is hosted through podcastgarden.com. The URL is podcastgarden.com/podcast/drugwarfacts. You can find links there to listen to or download previous episodes, as well as subscribe. And if you are a subscriber, thank you. You can follow us on Twitter, where we're at Drug Policy Facts. Also, check us out on Facebook and give the Drug War Facts page a like. Share it with friends. We'll be back next week with more news and commentary on the drug war. For now, this is Doug McVeigh saying so long. So long!